move to the work session of February 25th, 2025. We'll go right to item 2, which is general business. And we are going to discuss draft financial policies, debt, and donations. Doug.
I will actually turn this over to Dana.
All right.
While she's walking back and forth, I'll start reading the memo for you. But we currently do not have a debt policy, so this would be setting one up. So we will have one going forward.
The question, are they required by law?
They are not.
Okay.
And we, although we don't have a formal policy, we've had guidelines that we've been working from. But anyway, Dana, go ahead.
Yeah, so similar to the policies we reviewed last week, there's some aspects of it where this is not something brand new that we're coming up with. You know, the village has prudent guidelines that it's been following in making decisions whether or not to issue debt. If it does, it has followed LGC and statutory requirements, et cetera. It's more so formalizing it, and especially with potentially having on the horizon in the 5-year plan a much more significant debt issuance than the village has had in the past, and maybe considering something other than installment financing contracts, which as far as I'm aware is the only financing instrument that the village has used in the past, possibly using a different option. I felt it was, and it's also a best practice to have a debt policy. I felt it would be important to have something more formal, again, that is adopted by council and not just kind of these more informal guidelines that we're following. That's on the debt side, and then there's also a separate donations policy. We receive a pretty small amount of donations each year. They're usually either completely unrestricted. People just mail in checks or bring in donations to Village Hall. A lot of times, if there is any restriction, it's just, this is for the police department, this is for the fire department, this is for the library. Very general to where it's not complex administratively for us to monitor that we're spending, you know, in compliance with those restrictions.
Do we get many land donations?
No.
I'm just curious. People sometimes would donate lots in the past to the
There
village.
was a period in time where there were several lots donated. That was a long time ago.
Yeah, there was kind of a program that if you had a lot that was really, you couldn't build a house on it, the village would take it and we would, you know, our intent was to use it for a green space or for recreation purposes. But we haven't received a donation in that in probably a decade at least.
Oh, okay, thank you.
No, typically it is monetary donations, not land or other personal property. And with the construction of the new library, the renovation of the archives, there may be, and potentially even other projects in the future that where fundraising may make sense or where people would feel compelled to make a donation. I just felt it might be a good opportunity while reviewing policies as a whole in terms of financial policies to develop one that would guide us going forward and put a little more formal structure in terms of staff determining then procedures that should be followed going forward.
Okay, keep going.
All right, so we'll go to the debt policy first. And thank you, Mr. Taylor. I did receive some comments from Councilman Taylor in advance, so we'll go through those as we go through the policy and certainly entertain any other questions that you have as we go through. So the purpose is really just the background for why we have the policy. The debt issuances that we're allowed to do and everything that guides them are in the general statutes, chapter 59, article 4. A lot of the language in here is kind of either directly from that or, you know, to ensure that we're complying with those requirements. The Local Government Commission, the LGC, they do have to approve most debt issuances. When it comes to leases or things like that, there's kind of a flow chart where you determine whether it's something the LGC has to approve or not. But any of the debt that was mentioned in in this policy pretty much has to go through some LGC process. Their level of involvement and influence on it is different depending on what type of debt you're issuing, but the LGC is involved throughout the process. Some of this background here is, again, things that we already have in our guidelines that we are already doing and have been doing for a very long time and are just pretty standard prudent measures that you take when determining how you want to fund capital. That you want kind of a balance, a mix of debt or pay-as-you-go, which would be us using fund balance essentially, and to maintain adequate fund balance, and that if you're going to issue debt, you don't want the financing period to be longer than the estimated life of the asset. It should benefit current and future citizens of the village. Things like that are very common in terms of what criteria you would look at to whether debt financing is appropriate.
Dan, I would just add with regard to that, there is a philosophical point of view when you look at a project to ask, well, who does it benefit? If you build it all for cash, that's in essence been paid for by past taxpayers, and if the benefit is really, as would be the case, for example, with the library, the benefit is to be paid out over a number of years, that's a case to conceivably think about debt versus some other things where maybe you don't want to. So just it's a philosophical underlying point to this.
Yes, thank you. There is a note here where it kind of just to give there some flexibility. It being a policy, you don't want it to be so strict that it can be difficult to comply with and not give you the flexibility that the council or management may need in certain situations. This was one item, there were actually two on this page from Mr. Taylor. One related to referring to the good of the public.
Yeah, I don't know if we are under an explicit statutory requirement to always act in the good of the public or whether there's something in the state ethics. But I would think as a practical matter, I would consider that to be a pretty ironclad assumption. More importantly, putting that in a policy like this, it makes the policy more wishy-washy and subject to interpretation, which is why I don't think we need it. I think it's redundant, and I think if we pull it out, it makes the policy stronger.
So where would you put a period after?
Yeah, so would your suggestion be
After
just to
improvements?
remove that are for the good of the public?
I would just strike those last 5 or 6 words as unnecessary.
I'm okay with that. It's sort of very subjective.
Yeah,
Particularly given the bullet points below that further define sort of what are we going to think about if we're going to go forward here.
Yeah, hopefully everything we do is for the good of the public.
yeah. I mean, we do have, ultimately, everything has to be for public purpose, which you could say is for the good, but to your point, Mr. Taylor, what one person thinks is good may not be the same as another, and we deal with that on a daily basis, right? So I agree we can strike that. I think that's a good suggestion. The next item, I think was referring to this case-by-case basis, who would be responsible, who would be making that consideration. It would, and I'll add language to clarify here, but essentially it would be management and council, most likely during the budget process, right, as we're refining the details of if we're going to debt finance something.
But I think that the policy should make clear whether it is a staff consideration and a staff approval or something that needs to come before council.
Yes,
Yeah, I mean, any long-term debt would have to be approved by the council, so.
yes.
So we'll
So
just
I'll add that,
somewhere.
that it would be considered on a case-by-case basis by village management and council. Would that be
Sure.
sufficient? Okay. Then we're, policy making it very clear again, this is very standard and something, and a longstanding practice of the village anyway, that you do not ever use long-term debt to finance ongoing operational expenses. Then the next is just kind of establishing some responsibilities of the finance officer, which is my position, and the village manager, in terms of making recommendations. Now, I'm not making the recommendations necessarily in a silo, but usually it's always coming about from discussion in our budget sessions, and but at least that the finance officer has responsibility for doing the kind of analysis or any work needed to kind of make the debt financing happen if that is the direction that we go, and also maintaining rating agency relationships if we do obtain credit ratings, and monitoring the debt financing and making sure that we are complying with the policy, and if we issue debt, if there are any compliance requirements associated with that debt, making sure we're complying with that as well.
I thought it was interesting also, in the last set of policies that we looked at, the finance officer was the village manager.
That was the budget officer.
Did it say budget? Okay.
Yes, the budget officer is the village manager. Yep.
Before we skip by this,
Yep.
I don't think, speaking for myself, that the Village of Pinehurst Council is going to give great consideration to global or national financial environment. In part because the scope of what we do is not billions of dollars. And typically, we're going to at least partially fund whatever we do with cash that we already have. So we're likely to make a decision based on the collective wisdom of whoever's on the council at that time. And if we think it's right, we're going to go ahead. In some sense, we're all of us are always thinking about that, but I don't think that, again, that needs to be part of this policy, because we could think that the global economy is going into recession, but we want to build a library anyway, and we've got half the money, or we've got all the money, whatever
And
it is.
that may be an even better time. There were people after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, who made out very well because they pursued their capital projects, and the cost was significantly less than what they had planned on. So there may be times where it even works to your advantage, maybe not often.
I could also,
Councilman, oh, go ahead, Doug. Yes.
well, I could also see a situation, so like in the past year, if we were going to issue debt, I think, it might have been prudent to hold off a little bit till we knew that interest rates were going to drop,
I guess the only thing I'd say,
Or
I'm
we
gonna-
might say from a historic standpoint, they're still relatively low, and we're going to go ahead anyway, even if we expect, because we want to get the project going. It could be either way.
Yeah.
I agree with you completely on global and national. Local financial environment and economy
That's fine.
might be something I'd like to leave there as a general statement, simply that, what's happening in our immediate environment may have some impact on our decision process. That's all.
Yeah, I think it's something that we would consider at least, even if we don't put much weight into economic factors outside of our local community, to where personally, I don't feel it hurts to leave it there, to at least say we consider it. Even if we don't put any weight towards it or very little in the decision-making process, I don't think it hurts to leave it there.
I agree with that.
Would you change the word will to may?
But then that would also impact whether we may consider these other items that I think may be more
The other items,
important to
The other
consider.
items, I think we will consider. Yeah.
Right.
maybe as a compromise, take out global.
Like I say, global and national don't interest me much, but local, I mean, what's going on in Moore County, what's happening down the road in Southern Pines or Aberdeen or Carthage.
Yeah, I'd just say, I think national interest rates are very much something we would take into consideration.
That's fine.
Okay, so just strike global?
Mhm.
Okay. All right. And then I think there was also a question here, and this, again, I will add more specific language here where it says just the village will consider who is that's considering it. Again, it would be management primarily before making a recommendation to council, but then as Doug mentioned, council will have to approve any debt and would be part of that conversation, and we would be considering these things well in advance of bringing, a debt issuance to you for approval as part of our ongoing, budget discussions.
Okay.
Okay, so then here are other items that we will consider before choosing that debt financing would be the appropriate option for a given project. The interest rate environment, the village's current cash position and debt position, making sure that we're not over leveraging if we already have existing debt, availability of funds to pay the debt service, urgency of capital needs, and allowing ourselves sufficient flexibility to continue to meet future needs, and appropriate debt issuance practices and debt structuring. The next section gets into the 4 types of debt that local governments are authorized to issue per the statutes. The first is general obligation bonds. I won't read every word of this. This is not something that the village has used in the past. My assumption for that is typically you're issuing GO bonds when you need a large amount of money and you can't use one of the other options. To me, it's almost, maybe not always, but to me, it's sort of the last resort if one of the other options would not work for you.
And just to be clear, I think Pinehurst general obligation bonds would be very attractive. But if we're not going to sell 20 or 25 million worth, the administrative and legal costs are such that it's prohibitive. And I don't know that we're going to take on a project of that size.
I agree, and it's also the most restrictive in terms of all the requirements you have to meet, the steps you have to take along the way, which is part of what makes it more expensive and cost prohibitive for the village. And we do still have an option, the third bullet, which is limited obligation bonds, to where it is going out to the market. I agree with you, it would be very attractive, and our PNC rep has told me that already. He's like, I would love to sell some Pinehurst bonds. So.
Even beyond his commercial instinct, anyone who buys municipal bonds is always looking for a new high-grade issuer that they can add to their portfolio.
Yes.
Nobody owns any Pinehurst municipal bonds at the moment.
Yes.
They would be attractive, I just don't think it's practical.
Right, I agree with you, and again, this is why the GO bonds tend to be sort of again, this is a generalization, but sort of the last resort, if that's the only way you're able to fund it, because that is the only thing backing those bonds is the village's credit saying, we will make sure we levy enough tax revenue to pay the debt service. There's no asset or specific revenue stream that is dedicated to funding those bonds.
Is there any limitation in North Carolina about how much you can raise taxes? In some states, you have to go back to the voters if you want to raise by more than X.
Not that I'm aware of. I know there's a maximum tax rate, but I don't know about a limit on how much you can raise it in one given year.
Right.
Yeah, I have never heard that. That would be regarding our property tax rate, but I've never heard that.
Yeah, so like in California and Massachusetts,
They-
GO bonds
property.
are actually not as attractive because your taxing ability is limited.
Right, that's right. Was it Prop 2.5 or something you had up there?
Proposition 13 in California years ago, and yes.
So I do mention here, after just a brief description of GO bonds, just mentioning that the village historically has not used them because the amount in terms of the financing needed do not require it. Again, and I can expand on that if you feel it's helpful due to it being cost prohibitive or anything like that, but there are other options that the village would be more likely to use, in my opinion. The next bullet, the special revenue and special obligation bonds, I have this here because it is in the statute, but I do note that at the time, we would not be eligible to issue these. You have to have essentially an enterprise, so utilities or something that you'll be pledging that revenue stream from those utilities to pay the debt service on those bonds, so we would not even be eligible to issue those, but I left it in here because if in the future, for some reason that changes, the policy would allow for it. Next would be certificates of participation or limited obligation bonds. This is something that I think would be an attractive option for the village. It is, limited obligation bonds are sold in a public market, just like GO bonds. And so that is where you can get the benefit of that, but with lower cost. Typically, you see, lower par amounts being issued. This has been done by other municipalities recently for fire stations in the area. So it's certainly something that we would be able to use for that project upcoming if that's the direction that council goes. The difference between these or primary difference between these and GO bonds is the security for the bonds is the property that you construct. So the building, or if you could also use it if you're purchasing other, vehicles, equipment, things like that. That is what's backing that. So you, just like you have your home, the value of your home is what backs your mortgage. It's similar to that, where you have an actual asset that if we were to not make the payments, the creditor is able to use the value of the asset to make the payments, but that wouldn't happen. But that's the primary difference, is you do have an actual asset backing the debt. And then the final bullet is the installment purchase contract. This is, from at least as far back as I have looked, this is what the village has used in the past for its debt financings. It's essentially a bank loan that you kind of privately negotiate with the bank to pay for the asset up front, and then you make the debt service payments over time. You can do this with a range of 5 to 20 years in terms of, or I'm assuming you can go less than 5 if you needed to, but maybe you could argue if it's less than 5 years that you need to pay it off, is it worth issuing debt? But depending on the life of the asset, still not to exceed the life of the asset, and the asset is the collateral for the loan.
We would also have a capital asset with an expected life of only 5 years, presumably.
Yes.
And
Yes, but I'm just saying this 5 to 20 years is just typically what is used. I don't want to, it's not meant to say it can only be if it's within 5 and 20 years. So this is what the village historically has used, but there are other options available. Let me just double check. Oh, there's one note here.
the only question, Dana, that I raised is farther down you talk about taxable debt.
Yes.
You haven't really defined it here. I doubt we would ever issue it. Is it worth having that included just as a definition?
I can add the definition, yes. I agree it's probably not something that we would choose to do, but I think it would be important at least to have it defined, so I'll add that. And, oh, there was one other comment that you had, Mr. Taylor, regarding that we haven't used GO bonds in the past, and is there a dollar threshold or something necessary to justify the expenses involved? There is not really any specific threshold other than sort of, like I mentioned, the process of elimination of other options to where that is.
I'm leaving it the way it is.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to make sure. Okay. Then next, we have that we will use pay-as-you-go funding, essentially from our current operating budget or fund balance for assets that have a cost of less than $250,000 or assets having a useful life of less than 10 years, unless budgetary constraints require financing. That's really more so just to make sure we're only using debt and taking up the time, the effort, the cost that it takes to issue debt for things that are really worthwhile. But again, it has that flexibility that if there are certain constraints that come up, we would have the ability to do so. And this just mentions this is regarding the fund balance policy. Maintaining the reserves should prevent the village from needing short-term debt to fund operations, and that should be used as a last resort. If we are in a position where we need short-term debt, there has to be agreement among the finance officer, village manager, and village council that it's necessary in those circumstances. And the village will not utilize debt-related derivative instruments. An example of that is swaps. Mr. Taylor, you had a comment here about striking this, that it's not necessary. I'm fine with that. They're merely just as an example of what a debt-related derivative instrument is.
There's so many of them. I have a hard, since I used to do this for a living, I know what they're all used for. I have a hard time believing we would ever use them.
Yeah, they're so risky. And so I'm fine with removing that as an example. And there's so many more now than there were, in the past. And I'm sure people will keep coming up with new ones.
Did you have any problems with any of the changes that Mr. Taylor recommended?
No.
I went through it and I didn't have any problems with it either. Anybody have any problems with the recommended changes?
No, and I can.
Not so far, no, I didn't.
Yeah, so then this goes through details of debt structure. There was one question here. This is where there's a reference to taxable obligations, so I can define that. I'll make sure I find a spot to define that. And then here, in terms of selecting an underwriter, if we were to issue debt, that these are some of the things we would consider, not limited to just these items.
Would it be a competitive bidding process?
That was one of my questions, because later there's reference to the LGC conducting a competitive auction. I didn't understand who was doing
That's,
what.
if it's GO bonds, the LGC does the auction. If it's limited obligation bonds or one of the other options, the LGC kind of has some oversight and can provide guidance, but they would not be responsible for negotiating the sale or, negotiating the selection of the underwriter. But are there any other items here? No mention of net cost to the village
Okay, it says.
was in there, but it has overall expenses. But if you have any other adjustments to this language, I'm happy to.
I see the RFP process reference there, so I'm fine.
Yes.
Right, and what I think we would be looking for is lowest net interest cost to us.
Yes.
We want to borrow $4 million or whatever it is. That's going to drive the decision more so than the marketing philosophy. We kind of don't care what they do with it. We care what they charge us.
So I can add that in here, in addition to, maybe rather than overall expenses, being a little more specific in terms of the net interest cost to us, or, net total cost to us.
Net total cost, right?
Yep. Then within the policy, we're really trying to make sure that we're structuring the debt in a way to where we're not getting a short-term benefit now and strapping future councils, future taxpayers with a large burden in terms of debt service payments. And so that's where we're kind of wanting that debt service to be pretty smooth throughout the life of the debt. Not that it has to be exactly the same every year, but making sure that we're not backloading something unless that is really what is necessary, given certain circumstances. I know this was one thing you had a comment on, Mr. Taylor. Do you have any other suggestions of any edits you would want to make to this?
No. I think in general, I think this was very well done. There were
Okay.
just a few points that I made.
Okay, and as far as the level principal and fixed interest rates, it's not in the statute that that's required, but that is LGC's recommendation and their preference. They will approve something other than that in certain circumstances, but usually it has to be pretty compelling as to why you need to structure it
The
differently.
most likely structure we would use is in fact level principal anyway, because that's how they structure the loan payment, yes?
Right, well, that's what this is saying, is that would be our preference, is to structure with level principal. You minimize the interest cost that way. And having a fixed interest rate reduces the interest rate risk with variability. Okay, I think then
I think I did comment on, if you come back down, there's something about backloading will only be considered when natural disasters cause short-term We went through a period not that long ago of inverted interest rates, and that had nothing to do with natural disasters or anything else. So I didn't know how critical that was. The philosophical point is correct. We don't want to do that for whatever reason. But there could be circumstances, such as an inverted yield curve, where we might opt to do something different than we would normally do.
Okay. Do you feel the language is flexible enough within the policy to allow for that?
Probably,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah, that's certainly the goal, is to set guardrails and a framework, but still allow for flexibility.
Now, I'm remembering back, and I have no idea whether this will ever occur again, but the early 80s where short-term rates were 7 or 8% above long-term rates. Well, that would be a case where, again, on a net interest cost basis, we might opt to do something differently than we would in a more normal environment. But that would come under the guideline that we talked earlier of considering other factors.
Yeah, okay. So then the next section gets into debt capacity, and most of it has to do with ratios that we and the LGC look at. This is where we're getting into where we do have some guidelines already for some of these that the village has been following. And again, these are things that are calculated or reported to the LGC that they benchmark and keep an eye on. Ours are extremely low, if not zero, because we don't have any what I consider actual quote-unquote debt. We just have the debt that's on the books related to the leases and subscriptions that are required by GASB standard, but we don't have actual debt that we are owing to a financial, to a borrower, or a lender, rather.
These were all interesting ratios. I hadn't thought about them in the past. It was great to have some benchmarking as to what the guideline is and where, as a practical matter, we think we would be.
Yeah. So the net direct debt per capita is a measure of the debt the village has based on the population. Again, this is used by rating agencies as well as the LGC. And so, sorry, it splits the page there. The recommendation I have is to not want that to exceed $1,500 per capita. I have, this note is very tiny off to the side. Sorry, I was trying to put some frame of reference here in these comments. So in FY23, the actual for our peer group within the LGC was 582. But again, the majority of local governments in North Carolina are not heavily leveraged or anything to where we want to set something that is that's going to be reasonable, but not to where as soon as we issue debt 1 or 2 times, we're right up against our limit that we set.
The annual expense that we carry as debt, because the accounting standards require that we do it, it's $200,000 or $300,000 a year, I think.
Yes.
So if we divide that by a population of 20,000 to make the math, it's $15 per capita.
Yeah.
So we're even way under this number.
Yes, and if we had an actual debt issuance, obviously that would go up. And I think, let's see, so I think where I have it, this would be about 28 million. Basically, 1,500 per capita times our 18,000 population roughly means we could have 28 million in debt and still be meeting that ratio.
I think it's a good number.
Yeah, which to me seems that gives us plenty of room, and it's not out of line with what other municipalities in North Carolina use as a threshold.
And I like what you did with the next one. It's roughly the same number of debt that you could issue.
0.5% of 6 billion or something like that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Get you the same number.
Yes, yeah, that's what another thing I was looking at with putting kind of those amounts there is sort of triangulating to where one ratio isn't kind of way out of line with another, that as you issue debt, you should kind of stay in compliance with all of them. If one was significantly more than another, if we had issued, if this percentage was 1% of the village's assessed value, that would be twice as much as what our per capita ratio would allow for, which wouldn't really make sense. In my opinion, you would kind of want them to to kind of all cluster around, that it would allow the same limit in terms of borrowing. The statutory limit is 8% of the total assessed valuation. That is extremely high. We definitely would not want to go anywhere near that limit. And our peer group as of 2023 was 0.33%. So still kind of similar with the per capita, below.
8% would be almost $500 million.
Yes.
I
Yeah,
don't
we
think we're gonna-
report that in the aquifer, and every time when we do that calculation, it blows my mind that that's the limit, but we will never get anywhere near that. The next one is the net direct debt service as a percentage of the operating budget. This is the one where this specific guideline of 10% of general fund expenditures as a goal not to exceed, but that it should not exceed 15%. That has been kind of a long-standing in our guidelines. And then this final one that,
But that's the only one that we might bump into. Because we've talked about the public services relocation at round number 6 million and financing half. That would be 3 million, which would put us in the vicinity of the 15%
but
guideline.
this is the debt service payments in a given
Not the principal balance.
fiscal
Okay.
year, correct, not the principal balance. So this would mean our annual, the 10%, this was based on the 24 budget at the time, I believe. That would mean our debt service payments could be about $2.5 million. And we would still be in compliance with that. The final ratio here, the 10-year payout ratio, this is not one that the village has really looked at before because we typically don't have much debt. Even when we did, the payout terms were sufficient to where this wasn't really a concern. This is a common goal or a ratio that other municipalities look at, but many of them may be ones that issue a lot more debt than us, and they issue it on a regular basis. So this is a question I have for council, do you think this is meaningful to have in here if we may not really issue, multiple debt issuances at a given time? Or we'd have multiple issuances outstanding?
What would we say that the useful life of a new public services complex would be?
Probably 20 years.
20 years, right? And that was my only concern. At 20 years, you suggest we would want the limit not to be 65%, if I interpreted this correctly.
Yes, but we are paying higher pay. Yes, so did I put that in my note? Yes, yes, I have that over here. I'm like, I know I thought about that. That if we want to be able to borrow for 20 years or more, essentially we would have to reduce this. Otherwise, as soon as we issue 20-year debt, we're already not in compliance with 65%. But for other entities, like I said, where they have multiple bond issues at different points in time, their goal is to make sure they're kind of always chipping away at it consistently. So this is something we can either change. We would want to either change the level, the target level, or remove it completely, or this is something where I kind of wanted some guidance.
You're
on what
saying
you
if
think
we
would be-
needed to use it, though?
If we needed to use it.
Well,
correct.
actually, I have no problem it being there. You're picking a mark on the wall.
Yeah,
In my opinion, we're not going to use 75% of this document. Okay? And so, and with all of it, you still have to come to council.
yes.
So we follow a policy looking at it, but if we want to change it, or whichever council in the future wishes to change it, can still do that.
Yes,
So it's a guidance, and I think a 65% level, I have no problem with that. If somebody wants to throw a different one out there, then that's fine. But again, I don't see where we're going to be using it, or no future council is probably using it.
Well, my only, I don't disagree that we can always change it, but we have in our strategic operating plan financing 50% of $6 million for a public services relocation complex,
Understand.
which would be 20 years. So I would be in favor of making this 50, but I have no problem leaving it at 65, and we can revisit if as and when.
But I agree with John. I would just make it 50 now. Because as soon as we issue it, we'll need to do it.
yeah.
I would not go below
or-
50 because I don't think we're going to go beyond 20 years.
And then eventually we can bring it back up to 65.
Yeah, or add language that we would, similar to maybe the debt service percentage, where we have that, our goal is 50, or, we may have a goal of 65, but it should never be less than 50, or something like that, to where it gives some flexibility to,
Sounds fine. I think, again, we'll be there and we'll make decisions as we need to, which whatever council in there. Also love the strategy of, just amend the policy to whatever the situation dictates, right?
Oh, we do that really well.
I love
Policy,
policies.
the goals, yeah.
Correct.
okay. Any other comments on the ratios, or ones that you think we're missing, anything like that? All right. Then as far as refinancing, there was one comment from Mr. Taylor. And to answer that comment, we would only do this if we had bonds to refinance.
But in the type of borrowing that the installment loan contract, is that once we take money out, that is at a fixed rate?
Mm-hmm.
And if rates were to drop, do we go to our bank and say, hey, is that something that could be refinanced as opposed to a bond issue, which we're unlikely to issue?
I would imagine you can. I'd have to see, I'm sure a lot of it would depend on the terms of the specific installment financing contract.
We can always go to a different bank and borrow from them and pay.
Yeah, depending on what your termination penalty may be, or something, early payment penalty, if there is one, it may be favorable to do so. Say, I'm going to get a loan with a different bank instead, use it to pay off, just like refinancing your mortgage or something, right? I don't see why we would be prohibited from that. I'm not aware of anything, but
I thought
yes.
the language was fine.
Okay, yeah, but yes, this was something we would only do if we had debt to refinance. Okay, and then on this page, regarding.
Scroll down a little page ago. I saw it. There we go.
Oh, I think this was a question we had talked about earlier with that the fixed rate for GO bond sales are conducted on a competitive basis by the LGC. And I can add something in here to make it more, to clarify that for other bonds, it's, we can do it on a negotiated basis or private placement. Anything else on this page? All right. And then this regarding for solicitation and selection process for professional services related with the debt issue. This is something the village would select these individuals. We can have guidance from the LGC along the way, but they do not select them for us. All right, and then the final comment, I believe, was on the arbitrage. I tried not to get too detailed with the complexity of these requirements and more so just refer to them. But if you feel, Mr. Taylor, or anyone else, that there should be some more information here about what our arbitrage is.
Brief history, back in like 1981 or 82, the state of Alabama and maybe a couple other states noticed that they could sell 30-year municipal bonds at 10%. They had no particular project in mind. They took the money and they bought 30-year treasuries at 12 or 13% and just made 3% for the state treasury. And that arbitrage, that ability to participate or to profit from difference in rates was taken away. We could clarify it. We're never going to do it. You can't do it anymore. So I will defer to the council as to whether they think they need anything further, because it's moot at this point.
Yeah, it's a requirement that we have to do. We have to do the calculation. Something has to be filed with the IRS. And basically, if you are in a position where you can end up in that position purely by accident, not because you were, just because of the way interest rates move, not because you were intentionally trying to make money off of your tax-exempt bonds. And it's not a penalty.
If I heard you correctly, you can't do this, right?
No.
Well, then why do we even
Not
have it
the
in
way,
there?
not the way it was done then.
you can't do it purposely.
Right.
Right, but you still have compliance requirements where if you issue tax exempt bonds, there are calculations and filings that have to be made with the IRS to prove that you are not making money off of the investment of the bond proceeds. And if you do, and that you're actually spending down the project funds in a timely manner, if you do happen to make any money, you owe it back to the IRS. That's all.
I would be fine leaving this language in and not making
Yeah.
further definitions.
Yeah, I'm like, it's way too complicated of an exercise that I felt it was better for a policy perspective to leave it as just referring to the requirements and assigning responsibility for who's going to make sure that we comply with, the village complies with it, and move on from there. Just make sure it's addressed, but not try to get too in the weeds with how complex it is.
Okay.
And there are professionals that do this for governments, and that would be my recommendation, is you have somebody who is a professional, pay them a few $100s, a couple $1,000s, whatever it may be, to make sure you're compliant, because you don't want the penalties associated with not complying with it. All right, and then the final piece is just reporting and transparency there. All right. Anything else on that one?
Adopt those few edits and bring it back? Is that what we're looking at next meeting,
Yes.
probably?
Yeah, so maybe not next meeting, but similar to with I'll bring kind of the whole package of either new or revised
Okay.
policies to
You-
council to adopt at one time in the future.
Pick the meeting, no problem.
Yep,
Dana, this was certainly a lot of work, strong work. Good job.
thank you.
No, it's important that we have this in place,
Mm-hmm.
even though what we will actually do would conform with this anyway, but it's a good idea to have it in writing.
Yes.
No donations.
All right, so next on to donations. Again, this is not a policy that exists yet, and we have, we have procedures for accepting donations, but nothing this formalized. My intention is not to make it overly difficult or an administrative burden, but at least just to kind of set a framework to make sure that the procedures we have in place are sufficient and that we're meeting the requirements. So this policy is going to only apply to cash donations, which cash could be, dollar bills, checks, credit cards, gift cards, even if people give gift cards.
What about a car?
So it does not apply to,
So if someone said, here, I'm going to donate this car to you, you do what you want with it, we can't go turn around and sell it and get cash?
I'm sorry, it does apply to real property and personal property. The thing I was thinking of, it does not apply to people donating their services or time.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's fine.
Thank you for questioning that.
Well, it's because
I
I was
misspoke.
focused on the word grants and donation of work
Yes.
effort, yeah.
But yes, it does also apply to if somebody wanted to donate a piece of land or any other personal property, which would be, vehicles, equipment, any other items. And I think the biggest thing with this policy versus just kind of what we've been doing in practice that I think is important to set up is a process or expectations for who is allowed to actually accept the donations. Because the village is not obligated to, someone can want to donate something to us, we are not obligated to accept it. If we are not able to use it for public purpose, or we find that, the cost of maintaining something is more than what the benefit would be to owning it, or for any other reason, we are allowed to say, thanks, no thanks. We appreciate it, but it's not something that the village wants to pursue, and that is outlined here, but I think that's a piece that maybe has been not necessarily considered but a lot of it has to do with the types of donations we typically are receiving, which is just cash that are for, departments to spend. But going forward, as I said, there may be other things where if people feel compelled to want to give something, we have more more guidelines to follow in terms of what's acceptable. So that is what this section gets to here, is about acceptance. And that donation offers should be submitted to the village manager or his or her designee. These are the designee kind of explanations here. That a department can accept donations up to $5,000. If it's restricted for a particular department, it should be accepted by that department head. If it's unrestricted, anyone can accept that. The finance director can accept anything up to $25,000, and the village manager can accept, or assistant village manager can accept anything up to $50,000. The $25,000 and $50,000 thresholds are the same as the contracting authority that the village manager and I have. We kind of just gauged it based off of that, if you feel those are appropriate. Anything more than $50,000 would need to come to village council to have a resolution to accept the donation. And that at that level, there should be a written agreement that documents that for a donation that significant. Any real property, so land, buildings, roads, must be accepted by the village council. There's one.
I would think in general, although I don't know that this needs to be spelled out, our acceptance of real property is likely to be conditioned on our ability to turn around and sell it, with a possible exception of raw land. We're not in the business of creating a collection of things here. Someone wants to give us a car, we're going to sell the car and put the cash in I think.
Either that, or if it can be used by the fleet, or if the piece of land, as Doug said, the ones that have been donated in the past, it's intended for it to just be maintained as green space, or if it can be utilized for recreation purposes or any other purpose. If we have a way to use it, if not, we are allowed to sell it, yes.
The minute you hang on to something, you need to be sure there's not some contingent liability attached to it, like it's a hazardous waste dump or something like that.
Yeah, and that would be part of the due diligence that would be done before accepting it, yes. There's just mention here that gifts to employees, tips, gift cards, things like that, follow the village's ethics policy to avoid conflicts of interest. Those are not considered, or essentially through the village policy, they essentially are kind of treated more like a donation as opposed to gifts, since employees are not allowed to accept that. Accepted donations need to be reported to the financial services director so that we can make sure we're maintaining records of those, particularly so that we can keep track if there are any restrictions, that we're aware of them, and we can make sure we have procedures in place to be able to comply with those restrictions. Real property must be in writing. Description of the property, donor's intent. Obviously, we need to have proper instrument. And here's where we talk about what you had just mentioned, that making sure that if there is real property donated, that there's value to the village, that there will be some way that we are able to actually utilize it, any due diligence that may be needed, et cetera. Then we outline the ethical considerations, making sure that it's very clear that before accepting a donation, that there is no kind of intended, or that the donor is not expecting anything in return, essentially, that could be seen as a conflict of interest.
That reminds me, is our village ethics policy on our website?
It may not
It
be
is,
on the, oh, it is on the website? I know it's on the intranet, okay.
Okay, let's please be sure it is, now that we're citing it for.
Yep. To acknowledge donations, we will give receipts for cash donations, and then for anything larger, we do have a letter template to provide written acknowledgement, thanking the donor. We're not providing any, tax advice when it comes to whether those donations are tax deductible for the individual, so that is up to them, and that's specified in the letter as the acknowledgement letter. And then that the Financial Services Department is responsible for, kind of between the department and the financial services, that we're responsible for kind of managing the donations and making sure that we comply with any restrictions. Any questions or comments? All right.
Thank you, Dana.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll look forward to the wrap-up when you roll,
Good work.
roll it up, roll it up. All right, let me, which one is this now? This is,
Focus area 5.
oh yeah, focus area 5. Look, a couple items here. One, obviously, the person on this council who's been sort of most attached to this topic is not available to join us tonight, Jack. So I would suggest we move this to the next meeting.
Agreed.
I agree.
And I want to thank Dr. Morgan for making that suggestion. And two, I'd like to point out that I think both, because you raise it somewhere in here, Doug, that both Deb Ensinger and Jeremy Hooper, that we do want them to come before us so we can chat about things.
Yeah, do you mind if we have a discussion internally first before we bring?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. Go ahead. I just, I think it'd be a plus for us as a council and for the village to hear from two people who've been sort of involved in a lot of this for the last 6 months. So that's my only, is everyone okay if we move it to 2 weeks from today?
No, I would not want to proceed on this without hearing from Jack's thoughts, although I thought his email was very useful today.
Yep, that was very helpful. Okay, so that takes us to review of the 2026 NCDOT STIP.
So I have in the memo listed out the different projects in Pinehurst that are on the STIP. There was only one change from the 2024 STIP to the 2026 STIP, and that is the Highway 5 project from Blake Boulevard going north to 211. So originally that was both funded for engineering and for construction within the STIP period. Right now it's only in the STIP for engineering. I would actually ask council to direct me to ask NCDOT to fund that as soon as possible, and we will work with the SMPO group to prioritize this in future STIP projects.
That is
processes.
50, which one is that? 5892?
5892, yes.
Okay, that's, I have no problem with that. I think that's real progress. So it's something we generally have been talking
Doug,
about, and now it's closer to a possibility.
I agree with that. Do I remember, and I unfortunately left the printout that I did of this, there was some reference in there to the railroad trestle as part of that project?
Yes. So that project, and we've had discussions because they are in the engineering phase of it on how to potentially go around it. And we're going to reach out to the resort and USGA, see if there's a possibility of putting a sidewalk through their properties to make a full connection.
They're not talking about widening the roadway underneath there, which is a major undertaking.
Right. So
Okay.
Underneath the trestle would remain the same.
Right. Thank you.
There is one difference of significance between the last one 2 years ago and this one, and that has to do with the cost projections regarding the improvements to the traffic circle. In the 2024 to 2033 STIP, the dollar number in there was $57.4 million. In this new STIP, the dollar value has gone up 35% to $77.8 million. I mean, at that rate, by the time we get near construction, regardless of what the final proposal looks like, we're talking about $100 million plus traffic circle. So that's a significant change, and I don't think it's something many people have caught or paid attention to. But I went back and tried to figure out the history because I was curious. I just couldn't figure it out. I like to go to the beginning if it's possible. And if you go back to the original STIP that was locatable, it was 216 to 225. And it just had the same language it has now, just improvements to the traffic circle, which well, I think everybody's for improvements to the traffic circle. You know, I am. And that was budgeted at $6 million. 2 years later, you know, they do these every 2 years, 218 to 229, again, they budgeted $6 million. Now, for the next 2 cycles, we ran into the pandemic. So there was no new proposal. But then in 2024 to 2033, the most recent one, which was a year or two ago, the number was 57.4 million. This new one is at 77.8 million. So I just want to point that out because it's real money, and it does distinguish on dollar value between 2 proposals, neither of which, of course, this council, as they currently stand, were in favor of. But we are waiting for a revised proposal, and I think the NCDOT is serious in coming up with something. So we obviously got to give them some time to do that. But that's the history on dollars associated with this STIP proposal. So anyway.
Yeah, they did say that in this STIP process, they are trying to do a better job of forecasting and understanding that inflationary costs are going to be
Yes.
exist, and so they try to build them into the STIP.
I do, and they do say that 77.8 million that they're putting in today is what they are projecting would be the cost in 2030 when they're going to begin construction. Okay, so obviously in 2 years, the projected costs for 2030 could go up. I don't know if it'll go up 35% again, but so I thank them for looking prospectively forward on these costs. But anyway, that's my only point in mentioning that. And there is there was something else along those lines. Just give me 1 minute here. Yeah, I know what it was. There's a public comment period for the draft STIP coming up to 2026 to 2035, and it's now open and runs through April 4th. So anybody, resident or non-resident, can comment. NCDOT will be hosting a week-long drop-in period of February 24th through February 28th from 8 to 5 at their Division 8 office at 121 DOT Drive in Carthage. That's, they got to name the road there, 121 DOT Drive. And the public can ask questions and submit comments in person at this meeting, but you can comment at their website between now and April 4th. The contact for more information is Brian Kluchar at 910-773-8021. That's all I have. Thank you.
Doug, this is, I think, probably more for the SMPO to consider, but I was curious how you put a cost estimate when, in theory, you don't know what the plan is, because they
That's a
haven't
very good
told
question.
us what the plan is.
I'm
plug.
assuming that they picked a worst-case scenario, and hopefully whatever they propose to us costs less.
It's a plug. I understand that. It's like we would budget on other things sometimes.
I'm sure, given needs elsewhere in the state, they would love to save some money on this and reallocate it to other places, but we'll see. So,
All right. Well, Doug, thank you for the your outreach effort, particularly this Highway 5 Trotter Drive. I think there's some real benefit there for the village, and it has implications for Greenway and other sort of multimodal efforts surrounding Highway 5. So thank you for that. And That's all I have to comment on there. Anybody else have anything, or we can go on to
Greenway.
Greenway, which is another Doug one.
Yeah. So we had a request a few weeks ago from a resident that lives on Adams Circle, which is in Village Acres. And so he asked if there could be a connection made between his neighborhood and the Greenway Trail because right now you have to go all the way down to Forest or Spring Lake. It's actually not all that convenient to get onto the Greenway Trail. So we did a little research like, hey, how could we make that happen? Come to find out, we actually own a couple parcels here. I haven't actually done the back research to see if they're donated as part of the.
Predates our policy.
Yeah, yes. But we have, these two parcels, and also this is right-of-way that also belongs to us. And so I talked to a contractor. It'd be about $10,000, maybe $11,000 to build a sidewalk, and there is a little bit of a intermittent stream that goes through here, so to put a little footbridge through. I think it's actually a nice touch, and I think it would be helpful.
Where would the sidewalk, which way, east to west, north to south, where's it going?
So the existing greenway runs parallel to 15501 along
Okay.
the power lines right here. And so looking at the sites, I think this one makes the most sense, 455 Adams Circle. It's the flattest of the three. And so I'm just asking for your approval to, make this a connection and rather than a just vacant lot sitting there.
Say that again, I didn't hear the end phrase.
Oh, just to make it a connection between this neighborhood and the Greenway Trail rather than just sitting vacant.
I'm perfectly fine with this. Is another one of these sort of easy to do, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
And we would be in control of this situation when we.
Yeah, it just seems like a nice project to improve the community, that neighborhood, and give them access to a great community asset.
Is there any other uses being planned for that lot?
They're not.
Okay. I've got no problem with it. I support it.
Are they buildable?
Everything could be buildable, but they are very steep and they drop down off into a stream.
Putting a greenway through them would not arbitrarily prohibit us ultimately selling them to someone who wanted to build a house there, but it's unlikely.
Is unlikely. But I think that's all the direction I need on that.
Great. Item E, discussion of potential project to submit to SMPO technical, is that the technical committee or T?
TCC stands for technical, I forget what the
I
other
don't
name.
know. Well, I know it's a committee and I know it's technical.
What?
For carbon reduction program funding.
Technical coordinating committee.
Coordinating,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, so there's a federal program, or the money essentially is federal money that gets passed down through MPOs, and our SMPO is eligible for about $100,000, $110,000 a year, and so we have money from the fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 25, and we are expecting that we'll get money for fiscal year 26. After that, we don't have much confidence that this program will continue. So we have about $330,000 that is available for projects in the SMPO district for what we call carbon reduction programs. There's a big list of what that might entail. I am suggesting that we put forward to the TCC a connection between the Pinehurst area on Airport Road and connected to the Southern Pines trail system next to Forest Creek. So that would be about a, about a $400,000 project. 80% of that, which is the amount that they can fund, would be almost exactly what is available through the program. Between Southern Pines and the village, we'd have to cover the other 20%.
The other 75,000. I was at that SMPO meeting where we had a discussion of this, and we looked at all those other possibilities, and this was the most logical for the SMPO area. We're taking two of our largest communities in it, and it fits in.
Actually, quite a bit of it's unincorporated county, so you get the three largest.
True. I'd forgotten about that.
I do think it might be a little difficult for the SMPO to coalesce around a project, but I do think this is the most likely and it's something we want to see happen. It's something we're trying to build into our multimodal implementation plan. So if we can partner and, have other people help pay for this, that's a wonderful.
I think
win-win.
it's an excellent suggestion. So others have comments or thoughts they'd like to?
I support it, and it goes within our goals we're trying to accomplish.
Do I remember from attending the SMPO meeting that this would connect on the east side to the proposed Knoll Road extension?
So it would go past the Knoll Road extension. So, actually, no. It goes, here's the line. So roughly meeting down here, I think this is McKinnon Road, comes down here. This is where the trail ends at Forest Creek. I think this is the Knoll Road extension right
Yes.
here. So
Mhm. And we're just a portion of this, so we're doing quite well, because I think most of that is running along Southern Pines' part there.
yeah, and this is, a lot of it's Southern Pines ETJ area, but technically it's the county.
Right, that's right, that's the other part, yeah.
It would run along Pinehurst Trace on the north for the initial part.
So it actually wouldn't make it all the way to the traffic circle, but it
No,
would
that-
end at
yeah.
this neighborhood right here. And I think this is McKinnon Street.
I agree. I think it's a good idea for us to propose this to the SMPO.
Okay, Doug, you have what you need?
I do.
All right. Any other items people want to discuss before we entertain item 3 on the agenda, which is the motion to adjourn? Hearing nothing else, I'll entertain a motion.
I move to adjourn the work session.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Good night, Irene. Okay, we're out of here.